So welcome everybody to this evening's food workshop, where we're delighted to have Joyce D'Silva with us, who Tim will introduce in a moment. But first, if we could just have a moment's silence and a brief prayer. We bring before you, Lord, tonight all the creatures in the world who are farmed and for our food. And we pray that we'll find ways of living where we use less meat, and that those animals that we still continue to keep on farms, the way they will be treated well, with respect, and without pain. We bring all this to you, Lord, tonight, as we look forward to hearing Joyce's talk. Amen.
Well, let me just welcome everybody, and in particular, Joyce D'Silva. Many of you will have known the name Joyce D'Silva because she has been very active in this area for many years, in particular through her connections with Compassion in World Farming, but also through her publications, the most recent of which is Animal Welfare in World Religion, available now. We've asked her to speak today specifically from a Christian perspective. There's a lot to cover in that area, let alone coming across all the different religions. So she'll be speaking to us in a few moments. Her background is that she has an MA from Trinity College, Dublin, and has been awarded honorary degrees from the universities of Winchester and Keele, in particular for her work over many years, I think since 1985, for Compassion in World Farming, where she was, for the latter part of that, chief executive. She's also received an award from the RSPCA for, quote, a very important contribution in the field of animal welfare. And as befits an expert in this area, she has on numerous occasions given evidence to various government bodies, both in the UK and beyond. So I'm delighted that she's agreed to offer us a presentation today. For anyone who may be new, we are going to hear from Joyce in a few moments, and then there will be a period for discussion, conversation, questions. So do be thinking of that as the evening progresses. We'll aim to finish, as we always do, at 8:15. Before I pass over to Joyce, I'll also say that we have further workshops in this series on food. The next one after this will be on the 3rd of July, where we'll have Richard Kipling, Head of Research at the Sustainable Food Trust, to speak on organic farming, and he'll be helping us to explore some of the connections and tensions between agroecology, regenerative farming, and organic farming. So that's on the 3rd of July. But I shall hand over to Joyce.
Thank you very much for your introduction. So I'm just doing a little bit of book promotion at the beginning. So this is the book that I've written, which was published last year by Routledge. And as you can see, I've got some nice remarks about it, including from Lord Carey, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, who spoke on a panel with me a few weeks ago at the Oxford Literary Festival. Lovely guy. Okay, so can you go on, Tim? So at the very beginning of Genesis, we've got, God saying, I've given you every plant that's on the face of the earth, etc. Oh, let's go back to the original screen. Oh, I'm back again. That's all right. So there seems to be God saying that you shall have them for food, the plants and the trees with seed, which sounds like a very vegan kind of diet. Can you carry on to the next slide? And of course, after the flood, the Genesis tells us that God established his covenant, not just with humans, but with every living creature on earth. However, there is a strange contradiction, because if we go to the next slide, God also says, every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. And as I gave you the green plants, I give you everything. So it seems that although the covenant is with animals, it's all right to eat them too. So that is a kind of strange thing to reconcile. Okay, next slide, please. So obviously there was a lot of animal sacrifice in the Old Testament, and Christians don't do that anymore. Generally, I gather there are a few churches in the Middle East where they do still do some animal sacrifice, but animals are not sacrificed because Jesus was meant to be the perfect sacrifice. Next slide. So obviously there are various sayings recorded in the Gospels where Jesus said that, God keeps watches over the sparrows or whatever birds they are. And, they're not forgotten. He is aware of them and conscious of them. Okay, next slide. So I found in the New Testament these particular instances of interaction with animals slightly confusing. So you all know the story about how the bad spirits were entered into the pigs, who then more or less committed suicide. But I have read one commentator say that the word used to describe the pigs was legion, and that perhaps this was actually all an analogy about the Roman legions who were occupying the country. I don't know, but it seemed odd. And it also seemed, as a sort of someone who knows a bit about pigs, very odd to see that there would be so many pigs in a country where there was not much for them to eat, a sort of, fairly desert landscape. So that's just a difficult one. So then obviously when Jesus drove the animals out of the temple as well as the traders, but it does say that he used a whip, but perhaps, that was the only way to do it. And then, of course, after the resurrection, he helped the disciples catch more fish, who obviously would then have been killed. And then finally, where Peter was given permission to kill and eat anything. And there are all sorts of ideas about that just being that Jesus's teaching wasn't just for the Jewish people, but for the Gentiles as well. Next slide, please. So there are very helpful things in the New Testament as well. When Jesus spent his 40 days in the wilderness, it says with wild beasts. And it's interesting to conjecture, because it doesn't say, what was his relationship with the wild beasts? Did they treat him, in a sort of tame way? Did he make friends with them? They obviously didn't kill him. If we move on to, no, don't move the slides, please. So also you could say, well, Jesus stopped the animal sacrifice in the temple, so that was a very positive thing for animals. Obviously, he uses birds in analogies quite a lot. And he also uses the analogy of the mother hen caring for her chicks in his sort of desperate call to Jerusalem to care for her people. And he frequently uses the good shepherd analogy, which is something, the people listening to him would have been very familiar with. And of course, I always think it's amazing. The Last Supper isn't lamb or anything else, which might have been easy. It's bread and wine, which is, of course, a vegan meal, and one which probably many vegans eat, perhaps with a few additions every day, or perhaps some days of the week. Okay, so some of these things perhaps we can bring up in the discussion, because it'd be lovely to get your thoughts on them. So can we move on? So over the years, I have to say, the Christian church hasn't for a long time been very helpful regarding our relationship with animals. And one of the very important people in the development of Christianity was Thomas Aquinas. And, he says, according to the divine ordinance, the life of animals and plants is preserved not for themselves, but for man. So animals are only there for us. Next slide, please. And I'm afraid to get the same thing from Martin Luther. The beasts of the field and the birds of the heaven were created for mankind. These are the welcome possessions of men. So that's, and I'd say both those people probably were influenced by Aristotle, the Greek philosopher, who seemed to have a similar sort of idea about animals. Animals are here for us to use, to eat, to do whatever we like with. but there were people with different ideas. Next slide, please. I have to say this is one of my favourite quotes. St. Isaac the Syrian, who was a bishop, a merciful heart is a heart on fire for the whole of creation, for humanity, for the birds, for the animals. And I think that's just such a lovely quote. Next one, please. And of course, St. Francis, who we all know, had this amazing relationship with animals and said not to hurt our humble brethren is our first duty to them, but we've a higher mission. God wishes that we should help them whenever they require it. And apparently, not only did he sort of do a deal with the wolf of Gubbio so that the wolf wouldn't terrorize the townsfolk and they would feed the wolf, but also apparently if people brought in lambs, or if he saw lambs being taken to slaughter, he would buy the lambs and set them free. I don't know how he managed that. But if people brought in fish, he would take the fish back to the lake and let them go. So a very, very interesting character in all sorts of reasons. So let's jump a few centuries. Next slide, please. Well, William Wilberforce, who of course is regarded really for his amazing work to end the slave trade and then to end slavery itself. But with one or two friends, they actually founded the RSPCA. It wasn't RSPCA at the time, but it's the organization that has become the RSPCA. So he obviously cared deeply for animals and really wanted to help them. Okay. Next slide, please. So there are other famous Christians, Albert Schweitzer, who won the Nobel Prize for his philosophy of reverence for life. And he said, with reverence for life, we can establish a spiritual and humane relationship with both people and all living creatures. I mean, he was kind of Christian missionary to Africa. That's where he died. But he definitely wanted this different kind of relationship with animals. Okay, can we move on? So Bishop Baker was a bishop of Salisbury until he died 10 years ago, who I did meet a few times. A lovely man, Anglican bishop. And he condemned factory farming. He said it's wrong to exploit animals or be cruel to them in order to feed ourselves. And he was brave enough to say this in the pulpit in Salisbury Cathedral, where there probably were some factory farmers in the congregation. And, you know, I think he got a bit of stick for speaking out against factory farming. But, you know, he continued to do so, bless him. Okay, next slide, please. Andrew Lindsay, if you haven't read any of his books, you might want to. He's an Anglican priest. He runs the Centre for Animal Ethics in Oxford at the moment. And he's written many, many books. I think the first one was Christianity and the Rights of Animals. But he's very outspoken about factory farming, as you can see. And he kind of despairs of the church, you know, and wishes that the church would speak out against the suffering of farm animals. You know, it's wonderful to have individuals like Bishop Baker or Andrew himself, but to have something kind of official, pronouncement at the Lambeth Conference or something. But you might like to check out his books, Andrew Lindsay. And his daughter, Claire Lindsay, is following in his footsteps now and publishing with him. Okay, next slide. So David Clough, who I also know, he was at Chester University. He's now the chair of theology at Aberdeen University. And he says humans and other animals are fellow creatures of God, and we should be avoiding practices that inflict harm or suffering unnecessarily, only keeping domesticated animals in ways that are compatible with their flourishing. He's very, very keen on that word flourishing. He says, if a farm animal can't flourish in its environment, then you're keeping it wrong and you shouldn't be doing it. But also, I put a link there to the organisation Creature Kind, which some of you may have come across. It's something David established, and his idea was to get Christian institutions, churches, or whatever they may be, to take on the whole issue of food and animals, and to only serve, say, non-factory farmed animal products, you know, free range or organic meats, eggs, and so on, or to move towards being plant-based. And he's, yeah, I mean, he's having quite an influence, and this campaign of his is now going to the United States as well. Okay, next slide, please. David is a Methodist, just. So let's have a look what the Pope said, because the Catholic Church sort of has rather dirty fingers for having priests go to bullfights and bless bullfighters and things. But in one of his encyclicals, he said the compassion of the Lord extends to every living creature, not just humans. Next slide. So we got Pope Francis, who I have to say is a bit of a goodie in my book. And he says man must therefore respect the particular goodness of every creature, which is very similar. And this was in his Laudato Si encyclical just 9 years ago. And next slide, please. He interestingly, for the very first time, addressed the issue of meat consumption. He was talking to youth in 2022 and said in certain areas of the world too, it would be appropriate to consume less meat. And I imagine he's talking about kind of the Western world generally, where meat consumption is highest, especially in the United States, but also here in the rest of Europe. So let's carry on, and we'll have a look at some of the ways in which we do farm animals, and you can make up your own mind. So this is a picture of cattle in Brazil. As you can see in the distance, there are some trees, but obviously they've been cut down. But these animals, they're outdoors, but there's no grazing. This is not a field. This is a feedlot. And you can see the animals sort of lined up beside the road. Well, actually, you probably can't see closely, but there are troughs along the side of the road where, you know, the farmer or whoever his minion drives up and down once or twice a day and pops lots of grain and soya and so on into these troughs, because otherwise there'd be nothing for them to eat. So that's a pretty horrible environment for the animals. It's probably very hot, very humid, and they've no shelter, as you can see. Okay, next slide, please. So I just put that quote from Deuteronomy at the top: on the Sabbath, both you and your animals shall rest. And these chickens, this is a very common way of keeping the chickens we rear for meat, the broiler chickens. These are not laying hens, these are meat chickens. And they will be put into big sheds, about 20,000 at a time, maybe 30,000, when they're just kind of a day old. And of course, there's quite a lot of space, but they've been bred to grow incredibly fast. So by this time, they're probably about 5 weeks old, and there's hardly any space, as you can see. It looks like it's pretty hot wherever they are, because they appear to be panting. And obviously, this is a pretty horrible environment to live in. But when you go to the supermarket and buy your average piece of chicken, this is where it's come from. Next slide, please. And chickens go lame. And they go lame because, as I say, they have been bred to grow incredibly fast. Why do farmers want them to grow fast? Because if they get to slaughter weight in 5 weeks, that means you can get more batches of chickens through your farm in a year or 2 months or whatever. So most chickens are slaughtered at about 5 weeks, sometimes 6. They're trying to reduce, the breeding companies are trying to reduce the numbers of days to slaughter. So they're aiming at something between 3 and 4 weeks. So a fluffy yellow chick will get to 2 kilograms in 4 weeks. It seems unbelievable, and I wish it was. Next slide, please. And I'm afraid turkeys are also bred for fast growth, big breast meat, because that's where you get the money. And because they are so big, they often go lame as well. And they can't even mate naturally anymore because the males would hurt the females. So in these turkey factory farms, all reproduction is done by artificial insemination. Next slide, please. So laying hens, as you can see, looking at the feet, that must be a horrible surface for them to stand on day in, day out, kept in battery cages. And you can see the hen, she's poked her head through the wire mesh, and you can see that her beak has been cut back. And that happens to an awful lot of hens, even, I have to admit, some free-range hens. And it's to stop the hens fighting each other and injuring each other. So even if they do fight, they can't cause as much damage. But, you know, that's taken off with a metal blade, a hot metal blade. So as apparently the beak of a hen is as sensitive as your fingers, it must be really painful. Okay, next slide, please. So these pigs are pigs being fattened for slaughter. They're often kept in these horrible crowded sheds on slatted floors. You can see that floor there. Their tails are often cut off to stop them biting each other out of boredom. And we need to just remember pigs are meant to be at least as intelligent as dogs, probably a bit more intelligent. There have been various experiments done to show how clever they are. They can even play computer games, apparently, which is more than I can do. So pigs like to use their snouts, which are very, very sensitive. They like to dig into the ground and find little grubs or roots to eat. But you can see on this floor, there's nothing for them to dig their snouts into. So what they might do, the only thing of interest might be another pig's tail. So those curly little tails are cut off when they're just little piglets, and usually without anesthetic. So very painful, nasty, nasty business. Okay, next slide, please. So this is the sow stall, which is probably the worst thing of all. And until recently, this is where pregnant sows were kept throughout their 16-week pregnancies, unable to turn round. Now, compassion milk farming was very successful in working with an MP called Sir Richard Body, who had been a free-range pig farmer, to get this system banned in the UK. And it was banned here from 1999, Sweden a couple of years earlier. And because the two countries who were then both in the EU that kind of set the example, it's now partially banned in the EU. You can keep your sows like this for the first 4 weeks of their pregnancy, but after that, you have to allow them to be in groups. And I think this is another kind of post-war factory farming idea. If the sows can't move around, they don't use up many calories, so they don't need so much food, so they cost less. And if they're all in one big shed, then you don't have to have so much labor to go out and look after them in the fields, maybe one person instead of 2 or 3. So it was a kind of money-saving operation, but as you can see, terribly cruel, really. No other word for it. Next slide, please. So sadly, having spent the 16-week pregnancies, not able to turn around, then when they're ready to give birth, they're put into another cage called the farrowing crate, where they give birth, and then they're allowed to suckle their piglets for 3 to 4 weeks. But as you can see, they can't really have any kind of relationship with piglets. The sow can't do more than stand up and lie down. She can't turn around. And some farmers say, well, this saves the piglets from getting crushed. And it's true, it's possible a piglet might get crushed. But luckily, I'd say in this country, probably about half of pig farmers don't use this very constrictive farrowing crate anymore. They do allow a sort of adapted farrowing crate, where she might be kept like this just for the first 3 days after the piglets are born. And then she's allowed to move around and look after them, and she'll have some straw. Okay, but it's not banned. It's not banned anywhere as far as I know yet. Next slide, please. Then we get to dairy cows, and especially these sort of big black and white dairy cows. You can see the enormous udders they've been bred to have. Enormous udders have more milk in them, so you make more profit. And this was an investigation which Compassion Farming did in several farms in Germany. These cows are actually chained by the neck as well. Sometimes they're in individual cubicles. But cows are ruminants, and really, if the weather allows, they should be allowed to go out and graze. Unfortunately, this kind of farming, which we call zero grazing, because they never get to graze, is becoming more popular in the UK. And, you know, there are quite a lot of dairy farms now in the UK and elsewhere where the cows never go out. Okay, next slide, please. So Compassion Farming is right from the beginning run a campaign to end the live export of animals from the UK. When I joined Compassion in 1985, the UK was exporting about 2 million lambs and young sheep and about 500,000 week or 2 week old calves to Europe, to mainland Europe at that time. And the sheep, the lambs would be going for slaughter, and the calves would be going to be reared in narrow wheel crates where they would be unable to turn around. Luckily, that system of rearing calves is banned now in the UK and has also been banned throughout the European Union. And of course, the biggest news is just 2 weeks ago, the government actually banned the export of live animals. The trade had shrunk for all sorts of economic and other reasons. But so since 2 weeks ago, no more live animals, except sort of racehorses and things, will be exported for slaughter or fattening in other countries. Sadly, the rest of the world, the trade goes on. Millions of sheep are exported from Australia to the Middle East every year. Cattle are sent to Indonesia, to China. Cattle are sent from Brazil to the Middle East. It's a huge global trade. So although we've kind of taken really good action in this country, I'm afraid there's a long way to go. Okay, next slide, please. I'm nearly there. So this is just to show a cow which has been slaughtered the recommended humane way. You can see it's got a hole in its forehead. So cattle are usually stunned with a captive bolt pistol, which is a retractable metal bolt. Goes into the brain, comes out again. And then they fall down unconscious. And then they will have their throats cut or their chests opened. But it is meant to be instantaneous unconsciousness. And, you know, if you're going to kill an animal, that is what you want. Sadly, I have to say, pigs in this country and in most of the Western world are slaughtered now with gas, high carbon dioxide mixture, which is very aversive to pigs. So the pigs are put into, you know, big kind of crates to carry them. Then the gas is poured in, and unfortunately, I have to say, you know, they struggle. It's horrible for them. It may only last about a minute or 2 minutes, and then they will become unconscious and die. But it's, you know, Compassion and the RSPCA are both campaigning hard to have that kind of pig slaughter stopped. Okay, final 2 slides. And I'm stepping outside Christianity, but I do think there's such a lovely quote from Gandhi. The greatness of a nation and its moral progress can be judged by the way its animals are treated. So I think, unfortunately, you'd probably say there aren't too many great nations around. And the next slide, please. My last slide, really. So this is a quote from the Jain religion, which I think is rather lovely. All breathing, living, sentient creatures should not be slain, nor treated with violence, nor abused, nor tormented, nor driven away. This is the pure, unchangeable, eternal law. I think probably many of you would agree with that, all of you. Okay, so my very last slide is just my book again, in case any of you wanted to make a note of the name of it. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very broad overview of both position of various Christians, various teachings, and also the practicalities that we face at the moment. We have around half an hour or so for questions and for comments. Let me ask a couple of questions of you, Joyce, while people are thinking of other questions. You've been in the area of animal welfare for many years, and we saw a little blip a few years ago, I think about 2 or 3 years ago, where veganism did take off, and we've since seen a reversal of that trend, with various companies going bankrupt, and some controversy over the type of processed food that was being put on sale for vegans. I'm just wondering, just as as an aside, the proportion of people who are vegans. I was looking at some statistics earlier today, and although we might think it's becoming trendier to eat less meat, and there's certainly evidence that under 25s are eating less meat, the actual overall percentage is be fairly steady over the past 5 years. I'm just reading the figures out from a Our World in Data website, which cites a survey by UCAV. They do a survey every 6 months, and they found that 73% of people are meat eaters, 13% are flexitarians. In other words, they are reducing the amount of meat, but they're not absolutely opposed to eating meat. 5% are vegetarian, 3% pescatarian, in other words, fish only, and 2% vegan, 4% none of these. And those trends over this sort of period haven't changed too much, except that the number of vegetarians and vegans went up very slightly, I think in 2021 or thereabouts, and then it's come down a bit since then. So looking at that picture, I mean, there are different questions really in the back of my mind. One is for you to comment, if you would, about the rate of progress. If we want to eat less meat, it seems to be driven actually, I'm thinking of my daughters here, as much by climate change as compassion for animals. I wonder if you could just say something about the trends over the past 20 or 30 years as to animal welfare and where you see that going in future.
Yes, well, I became a vegan 49 years ago. So at the time, you know, most of my friends and people I knew didn't really know what vegan was. And they would ask me if I ate fish and so on. So I had to explain, no, vegans don't eat animal products. But I mean, certainly I've seen a huge change. I mean, most people now who I meet would have a good idea of what a vegan eats and doesn't eat. And they'll probably be anxious to tell me that they're eating less meat, or that they only eat chicken, which you've all just seen the way chickens are reared, I almost wish they would say they were only eating lamb, actually, not chicken, unless it was organic or free-range chicken, where the standards are higher. And, you know, there have been, you know, far more restaurants. You know, I went to Pizza Express with some friends yesterday. They've got a whole vegan menu, you know, separate menu that's vegan, but loads of stuff on it. And but it was interesting, you mentioned that some of the new alternative meats and things aren't doing so well. And I have to say that's something vegans, it's not aimed at vegans. Vegans wouldn't eat that because it's taking, well, most of them, because it's taking a cell from an animal and then multiplying it in the laboratory, but it's still from an animal cell. So you've still got this idea that it's okay to utilize animals for your food. But as a sort of halfway house of people who like to eat burgers and sausages and things, which, to be honest, I never did much, I think it could be really helpful. But perhaps I think people jumped the gun a little bit. And I think some countries are saying, oh, no, we can't have this because it'll badly affect our big farmers and so on. So, and this is particularly a problem, I think, in the United States. So I think one of the first alternative meats was licensed in Singapore, where obviously there's not much beef cattle farming in Singapore. But I do think there's a change. And I know far more people who are reducing their meat consumption or saying, or I only buy free range, or I only buy organic if they can afford it. So I think there has been definite change in sort of general awareness in this country. Not necessarily every country, but I think it is beginning to spread.
Thank you, and the hands are beginning to shoot up now. So let me ask Kathy to ask your question, please. And you're on mute at the moment. Thank you.
Okay,
Kathy.
I've been asked to be the first, so I'll try and be brave. I'm happily vegetarian, have been for many years, haven't managed to go as far as vegan. I'm also quite politically involved, and I'm wondering now, how can we get politicians to get people to reduce their meat consumption? Because it is not in mainstream politics at all. I think they would all think it was a vote loser, and nobody wants to touch the subject of telling the voters what they should eat. Well, what are your views on that?
Well, I mean, I think you said it. Politicians, I mean, just to tell you, Henry Dimbleby wrote a food strategy for the government about 2-3 years ago. And one of his recommendations, based on sort of environmental reasons, really, was that the government should encourage people to reduce their meat consumption by 30%. So other bits of his food strategy were kind of adopted by the government. The bit about reducing meat consumption was, as you rightly guessed, put in the bin. And I think if you think back to when we were getting rid of smoking in public places, the government, that wasn't very popular at the time. I think most of us are relieved about it now. But certainly food, there's so much sort of cultural stuff about food. It's what your mother cooked for you. It's got all sorts of cultural connotations. For men, it's being manly and macho and everything. So many things about meat. If the government said tomorrow, and we don't know what the government will be, of course, but any government said, we'd like you all to have 2 meat-free days a week, there'd be an outcry, absolute outcry. So it's really going to be very hard to government action. What Compassion World Farming is doing is working with the big supermarkets, the retailers, and we spent years encouraging them to raise their animal welfare standards and not to sell eggs from caged hens. And most of them don't anymore, which is great. But raise the standards of chicken rearing, the chickens for meat. But also for the last year and a half, we've also been asking them to, sell more plant-based products, and the proportion of protein they sell to increase the amount of plant protein. And that actually is beginning to happen too. So, if you can't get government to act, you have to kind of go around the side roads to get what you want.
There was a trend a few years ago for meat-free Mondays in 1 or 2 councils. I remember reading about that in the newspaper, but I'm not sure whether that's ever lasted very long.
Oh, well, no, quite a few. I mean, some councils are now only serving vegetarian or vegan food at their events. Quite a few, actually, in this country. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you. Anthony Roper.
Hello. Yes, I find myself, thinking about the initial instruction that God gave, as you mentioned, Joyce, from Genesis, and how that changed as time went by, particularly after what is described as being the fall. And yes, people obviously ate meat then, but there seem to be so many fronts nowadays where they're telling us that meat is bad for our health. It's pushing out wild animals. There's the percentage, we've got billions of farm animals. We've got hundreds of tons of grain being produced by deforestation, being fed to keep those farm animals alive. There's people starving. there's just so many fronts as a Christian where this goes against many of our ethics. I mean, you know, whereas as you mentioned about some supermarkets trying to stock better quality, we find that the big companies are putting in more and more of these huge battery sheds. They're not farms, they're factories really, and they're polluting rivers like the Wye and places like that. So that's destroying or affecting wildlife. I think as Christians, I find that quite difficult to live with that as a Christian. I think myself, do I want to be part of that?
No, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, obviously, there's an animal welfare argument and an animal rights argument for not eating meat, but there are so many other arguments. As you say, you know, the rainforest being cut down, all sorts of other natural vegetation being cut down to grow soya or else to graze cattle. And, you know, the food that's grown, the soya, 73%, I think, goes to animal feed. So
yeah, I've heard
Brazil be exporting the feed.
Yeah, I've heard figures as high as 80% goes to feed animals.
Yeah, and you know, most of the corn in America goes to animal feed as well. So while people are going to bed hungry, we're feeding the animals kept in factory farms because they never go out to find their own food. So it's crazy. And of course, there's climate change. And you did mention health, so I will just say one thing. I think it was 2015, the World Health Organization asked the sort of cancer expert board, who are from all over the world, the leading people in cancer research and diet. And they said the processed meat, that would be sausages, bacon, ham, salami,
was a class
carcinogenic. They're carcinogenic. They actually promote cancer, usually of the colon. And they said red meat, which would be beef, pork, lamb, is probably carcinogenic. But the processed meat is actually placed in the same category as smoking. So I'm just telling you, and you can look it up yourself. Sorry, you're on mute. Yeah,
I've heard those statistics myself. Yes.
Thanks. Two other people are waiting. Mark Dick has been waiting for a while.
Yes, I just wanted to bring up, I see Jeremy Williams did a book review on his Earthbound report on Cultured Meat by Michel van der Bosch. The full title was Cultured Meat to Secure Our Future, Hope for Animals, Food Security and the Environment. And I think the book drew out that cultured meat or clean meat or lab meat, whatever you want to call it, it can be different strands of different things. It's not all just the quite expensive cell line cultivation. There's the precision fermentation from bacterial vats. So there's different strands of that. And then as a follow-up, he produced 10 reasons to take cultured meat seriously. It was a very good breakdown of 10 different good reasons for looking at alternatives. If you take the view that you're not going to be able to persuade 100% of the population to go onto a fairly exclusive plant-based diet. So I wondered what you thought about the future for that.
Well, yeah, I mean, I was a bit involved with that book because Michel van der Bosch wrote it, but also the other editor was the boss of Compassion and Well Farming, Philip Limbury, who's written 3 excellent books about farm animals and the environment himself, one of them being Farmageddon and 160 Harvest Left. But I think that it probably will all take off. And I say it's not particularly food for vegans, it's meant for people who love meat, but do want to cut down on their consumption. But yes, it'll be a processed food, but it won't be as bad for you as processed meat. And it'll be much better for the environment. There won't be all those methane emissions, and there won't be the rivers getting polluted from chicken farms and so on. So I think it's a good idea. I may not be eating it, but I think it's a great idea.
Thank you. Colin McCulloch.
Oh, yes. Hello, everybody. And thank you very much for interesting presentation. I wanted to follow up a bit actually on the question of the alternatives and the, well, to some extent the ethics, but also the practicalities and the impacts from alternatives. You referred to the soy issue. I've eaten a lot of tofu in my time because I've been in East Asia for a lot of my time in the last couple of decades. But where things are grown and transported long distances, or the actual production of them involves deforestation, not the classic really, really bad deforest the Amazon, grow soya and ship it to the US as feed cake for feedlot beef, but just to produce soy-derived products such as a tofu, or can we actually achieve adequate nutrition in a reasonable way in terms of the protein that we need for a normal, nutritious human diet? I also wanted to ask you about insects, because there's one angle which I've heard is that various forms of farmed insects, very intensively farmed and presumably not occupying large areas, is another possible source of protein. I heard a story that in South Wales schools, they serve spaghetti bolognese, where actually the meat content of it is derived from insect protein that's processed in some way. So are insects animals? I think they are. They're not plants, so they're animals, but presumably they don't have the same. We don't have the same feelings about insects that we have, obviously, about cows and sheep and so on.
It's funny. I mean, we do have feelings about honeybees and things, don't we? You know, if you have a bee come into your living room, you're probably going to put it out rather than squash it. Whereas, you know, some other insects you mightn't feel so well disposed towards. I mean, I think the jury is out on the level of sentience of insects, and it will vary from insect to insect. But there is being more and more research done on insects and their awareness, intelligence, capacity for pain, and so on. And just because a creature doesn't feel pain in the same way as we do, I think doesn't mean that it couldn't feel in a different way. For example, I mean, nobody thought that fish felt pain about 20 years ago. And now, you know, every scientist will tell you, yes, of course, fish feel pain. And a range of other emotions too, fear and so on. It's all been tested. The first part of your question was about what tofu and so on. Well, I do eat tofu sometimes, but I have to admit, I don't have to, because there are lentils, there are beans, and they can be cooked in so many delicious ways that you probably don't need tofu, but it's so easy and quick to cook. It's, you know, I get tempted, and I don't know exactly the process of making tofu, but I think some people can actually make it from the soybeans. You sort of make soy milk, and then you have to add various things to it to make kind of gel. But I think, you know, you certainly can live, as I live, without eating lots of alternative or veggie burgers or alternative, you know, processed burgers, just by eating, you know, foods that are much more natural, even peas.
Yes, I've actually made tofu. Well, I use the grinder, but it's a very labor intensive. That's the traditional way, which is like peasant farming way. I think the stuff that we get in stores and tofu based products is industrially produced, as it were. So it's much more not labor intensive, but energy intensive. You substitute the one for the other. So there is probably a question there, actually. I think you're right about beans and so on, because clearly they occupy, or they take less processing in that sense, less mechanical processing. Yeah.
Yes. But I mean, I think soy would still be a lot less than, say, beef or pork or something like that.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. Yeah.
I wonder if you could, Joyce, if you could give us an update, given that we're in election mode at the moment. Have the campaign organisations, of which CIWF is one, but also PETA and RSPCA and others, are they drawing up a kind of manifesto for the kind of legal changes they like to see over the next term of office?
Well, we've lobbied all of the parties, and just last week we had an event at Parliament where there was a spokesperson for each of the parties saying what they would do for animals, which I have to say, apart from the Green Party, wasn't much. I think they're all frightened of committing themselves to something that we then be on at them that they must do. So, yeah, I mean, we're in touch with the political parties. They all have people within them who are sympathetic to animals. And obviously, the Green Party in particular, the policy on animal welfare and farm animals would be not unlike Compassion and Mill Farming's policy. And just to say, that meeting we had with politicians was Compassion and the RSPCA. We got together to do that.
So what would be like your 3 top asks if you're in the room with them and you're laying out, this is what we want to see in the next few years? What would be your top 3 priorities as campaign?
I would like to get all cages banned for hens, because a lot of them are now kept in so-called enriched cages, which is kind of not really enriched. It means there's a little more space. There's a token nest for the hens to share, one after the other, and they have a little sort of dowling rod across the cage, which they can stand on, which is meant to remind them that their ancestors and cousins are standing on the branches of trees in the jungle. So it's not a very good substitute. So I like cages to go. I would like the farrowing crates for the sows to be banned where they can't nurse their piglets properly. And I think I would like some decent standards for fish farms, because there's a lot of very nasty stuff going on in fish farms, and fishers do feel pain.
When you say this is interesting, because this is a new area to me, I'm very familiar with the use of pesticides in fish farms, but from an animal cruelty side, are you when you say fish farm standards, are you talking about stocking ratios? Is that the main?
Well, I mean, that's one of the major things. The stocking ratio is ridiculous. But also handling them, moving, the young fish from one thing to the other can be very stressful. And, the fish farms have tended to shoot wildlife seals who try to break into the fish farm cages because they see a decent meal in front of them. So, and yes, they used to fungicide, pesticides, all sorts of chemicals on the fish. And I mean, I remember it was probably about 10 years ago, one of the government's chief medical people was on breakfast TV saying, well, if you want to eat farmed salmon, don't eat it more than twice a week. And if you're pregnant, don't eat it at all. And I thought, really? So I'll leave you to find more about that yourself.
Is it true that the European Union, you're talking about banning cages? I don't want to get into too much technical detail. I might be out of my depth. But I did read once that the European Union was going to, I know we're not part of it anymore, but the European Union was going to ban cages. Has it done that, or was there some difference here?
Really? Well, I mean, they banned the barren battery cage, but they're allowing the enriched one. Just to very quickly take you through, because it's really disappointing what's happened. About 4 years ago, Compassion got together with 170 other organizations when we were still in the EU, whatever that was. And we put in the official way you put a petition to the European Commission is called a European Citizens Initiative. And you have to get 1 million signatures within 1 year of verified European Union citizens. And actually, by the time we'd finished it, we were out of the EU, so we couldn't count any votes from the UK. But we got 1.4 billion signatures from EU citizens calling on the Commission to end the use of cages in farming throughout the EU. And to our amazement, the EU, which has to respond to such a thing, they said, okay, we'll get rid of all cages by 2027. And we thought, wow, this is amazing. But then, of course, what happened is the farmers got together, they took their tractors to Brussels, they said, we're having none of this, you ruin our lives, etc., etc. And, we're not against farmers being helped to move to a different system, getting financial assistance. That might well be necessary initially. But so what's happened is the whole thing's been put on hold. And we have to see after the European elections, which are happening at the moment, what sort of commission we get and what sort of parliament we get. But it's been very disappointing. And we are so disappointed that we're actually taking the European Commission to the European Court of Justice, saying they failed to make good of their promises to ban cages. So we'll see what happens with the European Court of Justice.
Thank you for that. It's a bit depressing. There's several hands up. If your hand is a residual leftover hand, please remove it. If not, I'll come back to you in a moment. But the first person I'm going to come to is Barbara Eklund.
Thank you, Joyce. Actually, you touched on a number of things I was going to raise, such as sentience, and which you did a lot to get recognised, and the problems with fish. I just want to ask you about wider organisations. You've mentioned the Europeans that you've worked with, especially when we were in the EU, and even now you're continuing to. Are there organisations like CI, like Compassion in World Farming, in other parts of the world? I mean, this is a global problem, isn't it? What you're talking about, the animals being carted around the world in ships from one continent to another. This is a global continent, which is very different the way we're treating animals now to the way we used to do. So what's going on out there in the wider world? How much is sentience recognised?
Well, more and more, and yes, Compassion in World Farming, we definitely take credit for getting that recognised. Initially in 1997, we persuaded the then new Tony Blair government to get it agreed by the EU countries. So there were only 15 of them at that time, but they agreed that animals are sentient beings. And it was renewed in the Treaty of Lisbon in 2008. But yes, some countries have recognized animals as sentient beings. New Zealand has. Some states have recognized, but not full countries, if you know what I mean. Like, say, California. California has brought in legislation more or less to end factory farming. It's being fought very hard and will probably end up in the courts. And if Trump gets in, to be honest, it'll probably be ruled out of order, which is really sad. So some countries have, and obviously all the European Union countries. And are there other organizations? Yes, there are. Compassion, we ourselves have about 12 branches in the European Union. We have an office in China where they have to be very careful what they do, but they are doing a good job. And we have an office in the United States now as well. We're doing good work, and we will shortly be opening our first office in the African continent, in South Africa. We've had a lovely person we've worked with for years, and we're sort of taking over what she's done, keeping her on, and setting it up as a proper Compassion branch. So, we are Compassion in World Farming, but there are other organizations, obviously. Yeah, there's the RSPCA. In the United States, there's Humane Society, there's Mercy for Animals, PETA's, and I can't think of a country where there isn't an animal organization. They may be focused on wild animals or domestic dogs and cats and things, but most of them are beginning to embrace the farm animal issue too. And we try to work very closely, encourage them, share materials, and so on.
Thank you. Martik, your hand's still up. Is that another question? A follow-up, yes?
Yes, it's another question. Topic. Joyce, as everybody on here knows, I'm a bit of a nutter for a world parliament idea, which would allow a world food policy. But is there a case for protectionism short of that until my utopia comes into being, in the sense that we should really sort of tax meat and that coming from countries that don't have the same standards as maybe the organic side of the UK has? And should we be putting a carbon tax on ultra-processed foods and subsidising a healthy plant-based diet? I mean, could those things have resonance with a new government? They would all be, in my view, steps in the right direction.
Well, I mean, those are all interesting ideas. Yes. It's getting government to do anything is really difficult. But the more people pressure their MPs and write to their MPs, email their MPs, go to see them if they can, you know, these things do matter. And, you know, I've met politicians who say, well, you know, after hearing what you said or what your colleagues said, I've changed my mind. And so it, you know, I don't think all our politicians are open to changing their minds on anything, but this is one issue, perhaps it's beyond party politics. So it would be really nice if we could all put as much pressure as possible on whoever gets elected in your constituency.
Thank you. Colin.
Yes, thanks for the second chance, as it were. I wanted to come back to the point of though the question around land use we touched on earlier a bit in relation to the ridiculous awful deforestation in order to produce foods which then get fed to animals and whatever else, just sheer inefficiency and impact of that. But what about in the UK? If I could just very briefly give you an illustration. I live in Sheffield, and just to the west of Sheffield, we have the Peak District National Park. And on the borders, we have farming areas rather than the upland moorlands themselves, which are done for grouse shooting by some people, which is a different story. But in these farming belts, there's a farm that's just been bought by the local wildlife trust. And they're going to run it in a regenerative type of way, but as a demonstration of farming practice, not as a wildlife reserve. There are some areas that are triple SIs, and they're going to maintain and develop those in terms of the wildlife and so forth. But the rest of it, they're going to run non-mechanically, non-artificially, not necessarily 100% organic, but basically in a regenerative style. But quite a bit of that is land that is not really any use or practicality for grain production. They're going to put trees on some of it, which will be useful for shade for animals, but they are going to graze it with beef and with cattle, mainly for beef, and with sheep. And I wondered if you give your opinions about this question about British food security and our land availability, and how some of it could be completely rewilded. Should it be, or should it be allowed to be used for mixed farming in some way?
Well, I mean, if it's a really good regenerative farm, then it will nourish the soil. It won't have any overgrazing, and the animals will have a good quality of life. So I would say, you know, for everyone who's still eating meat, if they only eat meat from regenerative farms, organic or whatever, then that would be good. So I think there's a place for that for sure. But I think if you look at places like, you know, the Welsh mountains, they, you know, a few hundred years ago, they were covered in trees. And, you know, you get sheep there now, often neglected, I have to say, unfortunately, because the farmers live, you know, maybe 10 miles away and can't afford to get up every day to see that one sheep has broken her leg. It's tough cooking for that sheep. So I would much rather see places like the Welsh mountains reforested, really, with trees. So, you know, I'm not saying I have all the answers, but I think these are good questions to discuss and read up about yourself or with your friends.
Thank you. We've got about 5 or so minutes left. I'd like to spend a few minutes just talking about local churches and what we can do. Most of the people on this call, I imagine, will attend a church locally and will have different experiences. You've been through some great Christian characters over the years who made comments, whether radicals like John Baker and Andrew Lindsay, to the popes who made comments that are very sort of positive but quite broad-based. Bring it down to home. What should ordinary Christians do? Because it seems to me that achieving change, we've talked a bit about policy changes, but there's also changes in values, in understanding churches. In my own experience, I've been going to the same church for around 25 or so years. It's only the last 2 years I've been able to get free range meats into the church, as a thing from the cheapest, because that's usually what the people say, well, we can't afford this. Tips for churches then. I don't know if you're a regular churchgoer or not, but what tips do you have for churches? And I'd also like some of the people present today to maybe say a bit about their experience in getting animal welfare raised in the local churches.
Well, I mean, if you can get a friend or two in your church congregation and approach the priest, vicar, whoever it is, and, you know, discuss these issues, or give them a copy of my book or one of Andrew Lindsay's books or something like that, and try and get them interested if they're not interested. Because I think if you give them these materials, they might start getting interested and realize there's something to it. So I would suggest that you say, first of all, let's not serve any factory farmed meat at our events. No cheap sausages or anything else. And like you've done, only free range or possibly organic meat, and have lots of plant-based options. Or, I mean, some churches, where there's somebody very sympathetic in charge, might be happy to say we'll only serve vegetarian food with a vegan option, you know, kind of setting the scene, because as we thought, you know, governments aren't going to do it. But it would be nice to see churches kind of giving a lead. And I think that's why, you know, people like David Clough running Preacher Kind, and you said this Eco Church, you told me as well, and your own Green Christian, I think, you know, the potential is huge for change in the church if you all can be as active as life will allow you to be.
Thank you. Kathy Grant.
Yes, now my church, Church of England, fairly middle of the road. In some ways, quite modern. They have for instance, they have a gay couple serving at the altar, but I can't get them interested in the food issues. I have to remind them that I'm vegetarian, and sometimes at Lent I've sort of said, well, look, if anybody would like a hand in giving up meat for Lent, you know, talk to me. And nobody ever took it up. Nobody was interested.
Oh dear. Well, I mean, that's probably the case of, you know, giving them a book which has been endorsed by senior figures within the church, just to try and get them. I mean, it's interesting because I was asked to talk at Cambridge at Christ College Chapel and give the sermon at Evensong a couple of weeks ago. So, you know, and the chaplain herself is very keen on opening the eyes of her congregation to these issues, and is encouraging various people involved in animal welfare to do what I did, which is great. But I mean, I know you can meet an absolute blank wall, and I mean, what can I say? You know, just do your best, or maybe even say, well, maybe I'll go to a different church where they're more sympathetic to my personal beliefs about food and farming.
No, I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't. But I mean, apart from that issue, I like my church, which is a really good, friendly church.
Yeah. I mean, can you get some leaflets from an organisation or something? I know most people, everything happens online, so it's not so easy to get paper leaflets. And you know, we don't want to be using paper, but something just to sort of raise awareness. Or if you write to me at Compassion Rural Farming, I'll send you a copy of my book to give to your vicar.
Very, very dangerous to say that, because we might all put up our hands and ask the same question. But thanks, Joyce. I should have mentioned earlier that there's been quite a lively chat going on. If people have, some have been contributing to it. I just want to pick up on one of those comments at the end, which referred to Eco Church, and it was through our church registering with Eco Church that I think was a little bit of leverage to enable me to suggest we have free range meat, because when you do Eco Church, you do a survey and questions are asked about whether you serve animal welfare friendly meat or cater for vegetarians. So there's opportunities presented to, and sometimes what you need. I mean, vicars may read books, but a little bit of leverage at a PCC meeting or church committee meeting can help, and Eco Church offers that. I think the last question is going to go to Ginny Daly, or the last comment, Ginny.
Yes, thanks, Tim. I really was impressed with the Creature Kind website. I really recommend that to anyone to have a look at. I picked it up having read the Christian chapter in your book yesterday, Joyce. So thank you for that. It was really, really helpful. And they've got a brilliant campaign called Default Veg,
Yes.
Whereby they want organizations to offer a plant-based meal as the default, rather than we're having a hog roast, vegetarian option available, but actually here's this amazing plant-based meal, but if you really, really, really want to, we'll find you something with meat in, and wouldn't that just be transformational? I'd love to see that in my church. And what was the other thing I was going to say? Oh yes, research, partly in support of, to add to the work that Tim's been doing on food in churches. I'm doing some research as part of my master's dissertation on Christians and how they are finding their experiences of meat reduction in churches, what their motivations are. So I'm just about halfway through typing a message to put in the chat. Please, if you haven't done it already, please do complete my survey, volunteer to be interviewed. That would be amazing. Thank you.
That's great. That's great. Yeah, I think, if you're meeting a real blank wall with your vicar or with whoever, just say, oh gosh, so you approve of factory farming? Or do you think Jesus would approve of factory farming? It would be so outside, a direct question, try to say it non-aggressively, or sort of with surprise. Oh gosh, so you approve of keeping hens in cages and pigs on metal concrete floors? I don't know.
Yeah.
Sometimes you have to push it a bit.
We need to bring this to an end. I'd like to close by thanking Joyce very much indeed for giving up your time this evening and for presenting such a really interesting and informative talk, and indeed responding to the questions so effectively. So thank you very much indeed, Joyce. I'd like to thank everybody also for attending tonight. But if you haven't come across Green Christian before, I know there are a few faces and names that I haven't seen at our previous workshops. As I mentioned earlier, there will be another one in early July. Please go to our website and register for that if you're interested. And I'm going to hand over now, finally, to ask Barbara to close in prayer.
Can I just say one thing? It's been lovely kind of talking with you all. And thank you again for inviting me to present. And maybe if I come back in a few years' time, you'll all be telling me about how your churches are going vegetarian. Yeah, just keep up the good fight, and thank you.
Thank you, Joyce. Well, let us pray. Everlasting God, whose spirit broods everlastingly over the lands and the waters, and endows them with form and colour, give us, we pray, the mind and heart to rejoice in the majesty of creation and all your creatures. Teach us to care responsibly for our world and to seek the common good, that through your blessing all may flourish, including those on our farms. That way creation will sing your praise. In Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.